Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to everyone who's joined us on this beautiful sunny day. I'm Sarah Coulson, Curator at Yorkshire Sculpture Park, and before I begin, I'd just like to thank Art UK and Bloomberg Philanthropies for the opportunity to talk to you all today. So, for those of you who don't know Yorkshire Sculpture Park, I'm going to start with a brief introduction, a whistle-stop tour. And most of the way through the talk, I'll probably refer to Yorkshire Sculpture Park as YSP, as most of us do. And we're actually located on the outskirts of Wakefield and close to both Leeds and Sheffield, for those of you who don't know where we're actually physically located. So YSP was founded in 1977 to create opportunities for everyone to experience great art in a truly unique environment and to nurture a creative environment where people feel welcome, inspired, and at home. We've always believed that a shared experience of culture makes all of our lives richer. As the UK's first permanent sculpture park, since the very beginning, YSP has explored ideas around art, nature, and landscape. And in today's world, these concerns and our responses to them are ever more crucial. The story also began with a desire to celebrate Yorkshire as an important centre for sculpture. It's the birthplace of Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth, two of the 20th century's most important artists, amongst many others. We also wanted to actively support the practice of young and emerging artists and to bring the best of international sculptural practice to this beautiful part of the world. Over the last 4 decades, we've evolved from an incredibly humble beginning, where we had no buildings, no staff, no budget, to become an internationally renowned centre for modern and contemporary sculpture, where art and nature come together in 500 acres of beautiful landscape. 40 years ago, YSP was a private estate that the public couldn't access. And slowly over the years, we've opened up and unified the historic estate. And now there's a changing display of around 80 sculptures at any one time, carefully sited to draw out particular relationships to the landscape. The emphasis at YSP has always been on temporary programming, and our owned collection is actually very small. Many of the sculptures that you'll see out in the landscape are long-term loans, some very long-term, including Barbara Hepworth's iconic The Family of Man, which has been with us since 1980, and others are much more temporary. This means that on every visit to YSP, there's a really good chance that you'll see something new. And YSP is very much alive and ever-changing. It doesn't have a static sense at all. A key aspect of our programme is how artists respond to the site, either through temporary or ephemeral projects or permanent commissions. They often consider our particular landscape as a microcosm representative of the wider world and peel back and unpick its layers of history, both physical and social. Through the close and careful observation of the park's environment, artists help us to reframe, analyse and interpret our world in so many different ways. Significant site-specific commissions have been made by artists such as Andy Goldsworthy, David Nash and James Tyrell, and they all engage with the particular history and land of the park. We also curate an extensive programme of temporary exhibitions across 6 indoor galleries, including a beautiful 18th century chapel, and we have a thriving visiting artist programme, working with artists at all stages of their careers, and there are always artists on site at YSP. They're the lifeblood of the place. To see the whole of YSP, you need to commit time and effort, and importantly, slowing down from the frenetic pace of contemporary life is absolutely necessary. This often results in a renewed closeness of looking, noticing relationships between the artworks and their surroundings, a heightened awareness of changing light, patterns of weather, seasons, temperature, sounds and smells in the air. YSP is a dynamic combination of art and environment that's constantly changing. It embodies life-affirming well-being benefits of being in the open air, being in nature, surrounded by art, and enabling and deepening our connections to the natural world around us. So I'm just going to move on. So my 6 chosen artworks today, sorry, here we are. They all follow the idea of art and nature and relate directly to the landscape here, engaging in really nuanced ways with varying elements of the history, politics, and everyday use of the park, its stories, its life. The potential for site-specific practice to reveal more about a place and draw out layers of meaning is particularly fitting at YSP, where landscape and history are so central to the whole experience. Several of those works draw on aspects of the 18th century landscape design and its use of vistas, focal and talking points, and places to pause and observe. I'm going to begin with this incredibly special work, James Tyrrell's Deer Shelter Sky Space, made in 2006. Born in 1943 in Los Angeles, James Tyrrell is one of the world's leading contemporary artists. Raised as a Quaker, Tyrell studied subjects including astronomy and perceptual psychology as well as art, and through his family also learned about aircraft and flight, and actually gained his pilot's license at the age of 16. All of these experiences fostered a real fascination for the simple act of seeing and how we perceive the world around us. And it led to Tyrell having an incredibly deep and intuitive understanding of light and the sky. These elements come together in his practice that's not just about light, it actually harnesses light. It uses light as its medium in the same way that you would use paint or wood. Since 1974, Tyrell has been making works called sky spaces across the world. Incredibly simple in concept, but profound in impact. They comprise a chamber with seating, lighting, and an aperture open to the sky above. Their effect on the viewer is actually quite remarkable. They're spaces that give a focus for quiet, calm contemplation, and often give rise to really moving and quite spiritual experiences, and they shape how we observe the world around us. In 1993, Tyrell stayed in a small house at YSP for several weeks. He was working on a project at Dean Clough Sculpture Studios for the Henry Moore Sculpture Trust in nearby Halifax. And during that time, he spent a lot of time exploring the landscape at YSP. And he came across a somewhat run-down 18th century deer shelter in what had been the estate's deer park. Hidden away and only visible when approaching from the south, the shelter comprises 3 arched recessed spaces in red brick with stone pillars. It's built on the face of an old small-scale quarry, the stone from which would have been used in building projects and the mansion house on the estate. Tyrell produced drawings for a chamber in the stone behind the deer shelter to make a sky space. Unfortunately, at this time, the ambitious scale of the project and the extensive work that was required, which involved removing thousands of tons of stone from behind the arches, wasn't financially viable, and so the idea lay dormant. Some years later, in 2003, the Art Fund were looking to make a significant contemporary commission to mark their centenary, and they discovered that we had Tyrell's plans from a decade earlier. And at this point, it was their generous support that actually brought the project to fruition and enabled the creation of a rare publicly accessible sky space in the UK. The construction process itself was immense. Excuse me. Restoring and preserving the 18th century facade was critical, and it had to be shored up as thousands of tons of solid rock were excavated and winched out to create a space for the inner chamber. Tyrell's work allowed the feature of the historic environment to be given a new purpose and a new lease of life. Going into the sky space through this arched entrance, you pass from the light of the open air into a dark corridor before moving into the chamber within, which is flooded with light from the aperture above. When outdoors, the sky can often be seen as just a backdrop to the rolling hills and trees and lakes. But once inside the deer shelter, the sky is given a new lease of life. As you can see here, the sky suddenly takes on this new life and a new intensity. It becomes this condensed square, and we track the changes in the weather and the movements of the sky. Our awareness is heightened and the pace of life slows to echo the cloud's passage across the sky. The artist has carefully crafted every element of this space to amplify the experience. The concrete seats that you can see are slightly sloping, so you can comfortably look up for a long period of time if you so choose. And they're even heated, which of course is very useful in the cold winters that we have in Yorkshire. There's a powerful simplicity in Tyrell's conception. The sky space allows us time to sit, to think, to contemplate, simply to be. At first, we see just that square of sky, but before long, it almost becomes a portal into our own thoughts, and clarity becomes possible. It stands almost as an open invitation to access a peacefulness that's often denied in our everyday busy lives. Tyrell sets up a situation that encourages concentrated, meditative thought, and he describes this as wordless. So moving on now to the furthest reaches of the Breton estate is a work that was made the year after the sky space in 2007, and that's Andy Goldsworthy's Hanging Trees. A leading artist of his generation, Andy Goldsworthy is known for making temporary, ephemeral sculpture in the open air, using natural materials such as leaves, stone, water, ice, and wool. Working alone and often in remote landscapes, he records his work by taking photographs, as most of his pieces are reclaimed by the weather and the environment, and they're rarely seen in situ by other people. His practice also encompasses large-scale permanent pieces for the landscape, many using dry stone walling, and many also existing as sheepfolds, which engage with the artist's experience of agriculture. Born and raised in West Yorkshire, Goldsworthy worked on farms as a teenager, and this made him really keenly aware of the harsh realities of farming life and the hard physical labour that was involved with it. As a result, he sees farmers as the people who truly get to know a landscape through their work, through working it directly. Goldsworthy first came to YSP as a very young artist back in 1983 as part of an international sculpture symposium. And 4 years later in 1987, and still incredibly early on in his career, he was artist in residence and spent long periods of time on site through every season of that year. He observed changes in the natural environment and got to know his surroundings in really great detail. And he explored the park by making ephemeral work, and that related to the seasons, to the nature, to the foliage that was in season at each particular time. And that included dandelions, blackberry leaves, rowan berries, even snow and ice. And he produced a beautiful series of documentary photographs, which were published in a book called Parkland. In the intervening years, Goldsworthy remained in contact with YSP, and in 2007, having established an international reputation in the intervening years, was invited back to stage a major exhibition to celebrate our 30th anniversary. During that time as well, YSP had also grown significantly and now had large purpose-built sculpture galleries called the Underground Gallery. And in addition to a really truly exceptional exhibition in that indoor space, Andy was commissioned to make 3 permanent pieces for the landscape, which were intended to engage meaningfully with the history of the site, with which he'd become so familiar over time. One of the 3 pieces is Hanging Trees, and you can see this on the screen now, where Goldsworthy explores the idea of boundaries, which was a long-standing interest of his. He became particularly interested in using one of the ha-has in the park, and that's a common feature of estates from this period, built to keep livestock out of the gardens and other areas without need for unsightly walls or fences that were visible from the main mansion house. And he was fascinated by them as a physical reminder of the layers of history that existed within the estate. And he also felt that they represented a level of arrogance on the part of the landowners who built them, because they had this desire to emphasize their ownership of vast, uninterrupted swathes of land stretching as far as the eye can see. Goldsworthy's approach to the landscape was definitely a political one, and he aligned himself with generations of labourers and workers of the land, rather than the gentry who had occupied the mansion house at the centre of the estate. Although there are ha-has running across YSP, Goldsworthy wanted to make a work at the furthest reaches of the estate, so that it was hidden and had to be discovered within the landscape. And it takes roughly sort of half an hour to 40 minutes to actually walk from the entrance of YSP to find this work by Goldsworthy. He also wanted to create a deliberately opposing aesthetic to that of the landscape design. So rather than making a highly visible grand gesture, he made a work that was difficult to find, that was almost buried, and existing almost sort of within the ground and turning inwards rather than outwards towards those vast, far-reaching views. The area of land that he chose was interesting to him for several reasons. And here the ha-ha marks the boundary between YSP-owned land and land that's owned by a farmer on the other side. So by using a dividing wall, in a sense, he's created a potentially tense situation. He's put his work in a no man's land and raises issues of ownership. Because in a sense, half of the work is on YSP's side and half is on the farmer's side. And he was aware that to get permission to be able to build this work, he was going to have to enter into a process of negotiation, discussion, and exchange with other people, with various series of people and stakeholders. And this actual process of negotiation is something that is quite central in his practice. Hanging Trees itself was created, sorry, in a dilapidated section of a freestanding ha-ha, which existed within this ditch here that you can see. And the work comprises 3 rectangular chambers, which you can just see kind of moving off into the centre of the image. And they're like sarcophagi. They're each several feet deep, and they contain the fallen trunk of an oak tree, which you can see in this image here. Each of these chambers contains a horizontally suspended tree. And these trees are embedded into the dry stone walls that you can see. The trees were installed first, and then the walls built up around the tree trunk. And opening up these deep pits in the landscape seems to offer a view into its kind of very interior, both physically and metaphorically, so that layers of history are almost exposed as we look inside. There's also an ambiguity to these buried trees. On one hand, they seem energetic and writhing, and on the other, it seems like they've been laid to rest. Goldsworthy himself said, "You wonder whether the tree is growing out of the enclosure or whether it is a place for it to decay. I think ultimately, for me, it is both." For years, Goldsworthy has been interested in the relationship between trees and dry stone walls. And though stone is obviously seen as the more solid, the more permanent, it was actually the relentless growth of the surrounding tree roots that had actually caused this ha-ha to collapse in places in the first place. And this is something that the artist describes as a flashpoint of friction between the 2 separate elements. The next work that I'm going to look at is, it's actually on a kind of circular walk between these works. And it's another artist associated with the British land art movement, David Nash, and the work is called 71 Steps, which you can see here. As a child, David Nash spent his holidays in North Wales, and it was something that had a really big impact on him, that sense of kind of watching the seasons pass and sort of being highly kind of intensified. It's such a quite extreme environment in places. And so whilst he was still a student in London in 1967, he actually bought a cottage in Wales for very little money. And his intention was to be able to live an economically free life. And he'd looked at some of the students who'd left college before him and seen how trying to have a studio in London was so kind of financially crippling that they had to have jobs to support their practice, and didn't have the time to spend on their artwork, much as many people find themselves in a similar situation these days. So David managed to find a very cheap property in Wales and decided to take himself out of the London art scene and to exist this kind of in this very simple way in rural Wales. In 1968, he actually bought a disused Methodist chapel called Capel Rue in the mining town of Blaenau Festiniog, and he's lived and works there ever since. And he was fascinated by artists such as Brancusi, who he felt kind of really combined their studio life with their home life. And the chapel has existed throughout David Nash's career as both studio and home, and his practice is bound together with every other aspect of his life. He also owns an area of land called Cainny Coed, which is where he has been experimenting with planting works for decades now, and the most important of which is the ash dome, a circle of 22 ash trees that have been tended and trained by the artist since 1977 to make a domed cathedral-like space, which sadly is now in the process of succumbing to ash dieback. David Nash was also resident at YSP in the early stages of his career, as Goldsworthy was, and he had a year-long fellowship in 1981 through to 1982. He used the landscape as a laboratory for new ideas, as artists continue to do today. And like Goldsworthy, 6 years later, Nash developed an intimate understanding of the estate, taking the site and its particular ecology as a starting point for a wide range of new and experimental works, including ice stoves, plantings, and a wood quarry where he used every single element of a tree to make different sculptures over an intense 20-day period. The artist's relationship with the park continued, and in 2010 he returned to stage a career retrospective across 3 galleries and the open air, which featured over 200 works from over 40 years of making. And as part of this extensive show, he was also invited to make a permanent work. And after exploring the site once again, he proposed replacing some existing worn steps that led from the lakes in the valley bottom up towards Oxley Bank, which is where Goldsworthy's works are sited. It's one of the highest points of the park. And he was also really taken by the idea of a site-appropriate and site-useful work, hence making these steps, which he says make the process of walking up the hill very much easier, because he's placed them in such a way that they follow a kind of a natural walking pattern, which the previous steps absolutely didn't do. It was very difficult to walk up them. 71 steps took weeks to make on site, and every single wooden step was charred over a fire before having its rough outer surface scraped away, and it was then all burned again with a blowtorch for a finer, denser texture. Surface was then oiled to protect it and to intensify its colour. And David uses this process of blackening to ensure that the form is seen first, rather than what he describes as the woodiness of the material. And he uses charring rather than something such as paint, because then the colour is actually integral to the material, is part of the material, rather than being superficial and sitting on its surface. And he's used this process of controlled burning since the 80s. So Nash completed the work with several tons of coal, which you can see around the steps. And it was not only to emphasise their blackness, but also to link with the history and location of the estate, sort of literally linking us to the earth beneath our feet. But also coal is vitally important to the region, and mines sustained our region of kind of west into South Yorkshire for generations. And coal was also the source of the estate's original riches. Time is also possibly one of the most important aspects of Nash's work, and he rarely considers a work entirely finished. So due to the nature of the materials, they will weather in the landscape over time, their colour will change, their texture will change. But also with a work like 71 Steps, it's intended to be walked on, and it's obviously subject to the extremes of weather. And he describes it as a going work, which means that it's in a continual process of slow deterioration and a return back to the earth from which it came. Having walked up the 71 steps, you pass through a wooded area where the ground is covered with shallow tree roots, which in many places are raised above the ground. And here you'll also discover Hulibhutto's speed breakers, which were made, sorry, it says 2002, it's actually 2012. I hadn't spotted that one. So unlike the large-scale sculptural works that I've discussed so far, this work is very slight, it's hidden. It could easily be missed or mistaken for something else. It invites you to do a double take and look carefully, look closely. It asks of you that you're alert and awake to the environment around you. Based in India, Hulibhutto was a visiting artist at YSP in 2012. And like many others, like Goldsworthy and Nash before her, spent a great deal of time walking the site, getting to know the landscape, and allowing herself to find areas that piqued her interest. She often creates site-specific works and relates her work to memory, personal experience, and belonging. She deals with themes such as geology, excavation, and ruins, and they all relate to a process of uncovering things that are hidden, and finding material ways to convey a sense of place. Her work has quite a disruptive quality, and she often explores elements beneath the surface, the relationship between what lies beneath and the layer of the surface, and between life and death, the authentic and the unreal. And as Bhutto spent time walking and researching, she became drawn to the trees and their related narratives and stories. She drew inspiration from Indian folklore around forests and also began researching English stories about trees. At the same time, she grew fascinated by the woodland at Oxley Bank that has many beech trees, and in spring is absolutely filled with bluebells. It's beautiful. Bhutto discovered that beech trees were once thought to have been deadly to snakes and to ward them off. And inspired by both the location and stories and folklore like this, she decided to make a work that combined all of these ideas. Speed breakers are made in bronze and they're cast from the roots of a nearby fallen tree, a fallen beech tree, and they really echo that kind of serpentine root form. The artist then reintegrated these bronze works into the walking route through the woodlands, in and amongst the real tree roots, and they're barely perceptible as being any different from them unless you really look closely. And sometimes the patina of the bronze is scuffed, so you get a little kind of golden glint that catches your eye. Or if you possibly reach down to touch them, you realise that they're not real tree roots. And the title, Speed Breakers, also refers to that process of discovery that's so special about a work like this. It can literally stop you in your tracks. It can make you pause and take the time to look. And this process of slowing down that I've mentioned before is one of the real magical things about a visit to YSP. Like Goldsworthy and Nash, Bhutto's work has a timeless quality, reaching back into the history of the land. And she also says that the work relates back to the Bronze Age layered in the earth. Her choice of materials is also interesting. Bronze is known as a traditional and precious sculptural material, often used for works elevated above the ground on plinths. Yet she subverted this notion of bronze sculpture by actually embedding it into the earth, surrounding it by dirt and fallen leaves, and inviting it to be walked on by tens and hundreds of thousands of feet every year. From Bhutto's quiet statement, I'm going to move on to a very different work by Alfredo Jar, The Garden of Good and Evil. Alfredo Jar's work also engages with the landscape of the park, but does so in a way that extends into a wider consideration of pressing global political issues. Chilean born, but based in the USA for over 40 years, Alfredo Jar is considered one of the most politically engaged artists practicing in the world today. In 2017, he had a major exhibition in our underground galleries comprising installations of film and photography indoors, and a newly commissioned work, The Garden of Good and Evil, for the open-air terrace outside the gallery. Following the exhibition, this outdoor work was generously donated to ISP by the artist and the organisation Apolitical, which supports artists who are making really kind of keenly politically engaged works. And at this point, when the work entered the collection, it was resited into its current location, where it nestles unsettling in a young woodland adjacent to one of YSP's 2 lakes. The Garden of Good and Evil, like much of Jar's work, tackles some of the most difficult and traumatic subjects that we're facing today. His work addresses social injustice, human rights abuses, genocide, refugee crises, and the global imbalance of power, often revealing to us how these situations impact on particular individuals, and thereby humanising their stories and allowing their stories to be told, rather than them being seen as anonymous or faceless. The Garden of Good and Evil is made up of 10 steel cells that reference the cells used for prisoners at black sites. And black sites are the secret detention facilities operated around the world by the CIA. And by placing his cells within a woodland landscape, Jar has partially obscured them from view, echoing the way these sites of interrogation and torture are concealed from public awareness. As you walk up the slope and amongst the trees, these steel sculptures and structures are slowly revealed and feel like a really disconcerting discovery in an otherwise peaceful pastoral landscape. Jar talks of finding a balance between information and poetry, and which he says is particularly important when dealing with difficult subjects. And to him, the use of the landscape setting is an element that's necessary with this kind of highly political work when presenting it to the public. The cells each have a base that measures 1 metre by 1 metre. And some of the cells are 1 metre in height. You can see the smaller one to the right of the screen. And others are around 2 metres. So just sufficient to house a human body, either crouching or standing. The idea for the 1 metre square base was drawn from a poem called One Square Metre of Prison by Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, who spent many years imprisoned or in exile. The form of the cells also relates in formal terms to the minimalist movement and the use of pared back geometric forms. But Jar talks about wanting to kind of counter that idea by bringing content, humanity and stories back to the idea of the minimalist cube. The way this sculpture is experienced changes greatly through the seasons, something that's unique to sculpture in the open air, and one of the things I love the most about working with art in this way. In summer, it's at its most concealed, hidden by the kind of verdant leaves of the trees. In autumn, as you can see here, the rich colours of the leaves echo the rusting steel forms. And in winter, there's a stark backdrop of kind of skeletal trees that make for a really stark encounter. One of the cells has actually been installed in the water of the lake and looks really rather beautiful there. But it acts in one way as a marker for the rest of the work, which is in the woodland beyond. But in another way, its location induces a feeling of fear, of claustrophobia, and imagining the possibility of being inside this cell. From the Garden of Good and Evil, I'll move on to the last work that I'll share with you today, and the newest addition to the YSP collection. Like Jar's work, it's motivated by a reaction to a pressing contemporary issue, but in this case, it's climate emergency. Silence, Alone in a World of Wounds was created on site at YSP earlier this year by artists Heather Peake and Ivan Morrison, and was the first commission of the Oak Project, which is a partnership between Yorkshire Sculpture Park, the University of Derby, and the Bronze Oak Project, which is a not-for-profit organisation that promotes art as a way to create nature connectedness. Peake and Morrison have a collaborative way of working that embraces art, architecture, theatre, social practice, many different aspects. And in 2003, they established Studio Morrison, which is an artist-led creative practice, which navigates the expanded field of art through the way they realise projects with a range of people, including engineers, musicians, fabricators, curators, to name just a few. And a central mission of their collaborative work is to bring meaning, beauty, and purpose to everyday life. Silence was the artist's response to the question, can art save us from extinction? It's a circular sculptural space, another view of it here, that stands next to the upper lake at YSP and embraces a cluster of birch trees. The structure has been built around the trees, they grow within it and through it. So the artwork feels intertwined with its natural environment, as though the two are physically bound together. And you can walk through the ring-shaped form of the corridor created by an inner and outer wall, weaving in and out of the tree's trunks in places. And the open framework of the structure allows a view of the surrounding landscape and lake from within. This simple but beautifully constructed pavilion creates a space for quiet and meditative contemplation, an oasis of calm in the landscape, where you're invited to sit in silence, in communion with the world around you, and listen to the sounds of the woodland, to the birds, to the adjacent movement of the water. It's made from natural materials that have been sustainably sourced, either from locally to YSP or to the artist base in Wales. It was hand-built on site using traditional building techniques and skills that have been passed down through generations and that have minimal impact on their surroundings. The roof is made from heather thatch, sourced from the North York Moors National Park, as part of a clearing process intended to help with the management of moorland fires. The thatch is fixed in place using willow branches from clearing work in the landscape at YSP. The timber frame is grand fir and western hemlock, taken from the artist's own forest, and either having fallen naturally due to being windblown or having been felled as part of strategic forest regeneration projects. The rammed earth walls that you can see at the bottom provide the base and lower part of the work. And this material again comes either directly from YSP's own land, and some of it is recycled from the artist's previous projects. And the earth is compacted by hand in a process that is extremely environmentally friendly. In time, the whole structure, and who knows how long, will slowly decay and return to the ground from which it came. An inherent, an inevitable process of decay that was also an important consideration in works by Nash and Goldsworthy. The work's purpose and that of the Oak Project is to foster a greater sense of connectedness to nature, in the hope that an increased connection will lead to increased care and in turn a desire to take positive acts to protect the environment. And an audio meditation accompanies the work, aimed at helping us to be present in the moment and to open our minds to this experience. And all this work is underpinned by research evidence by the Nature Connectedness Research Group at the University of Derby. Speaking about the commission and its wider importance and impact, Heather Peake said, "Our work for the Oak Project must open the viewer's eyes to the natural world, wounds and all, and through the shared grief create action, turning towards the world for what it has to teach us. We propose a space that is a kind of education of attention that offers a protracted introduction in seeing things, hearing and feeling them. This work is a gift of time and attention." And on that beautiful and thought-provoking quote, I'm going to end my talk. So thank you so much for joining us today and taking the time out on this really beautiful warm day to listen to what I had to say about the Sculpture Park, and I hope that you'll be able to visit us soon. And thank you very much. And there's some information here about the next talk. So thanks again for joining. Bye.